Hi there, I'm Mel Schenck. These are exciting times for architects and the public as architecture moves beyond modernism now into the information age. This presentation focuses on the characteristics of this new architecture and shows how Vietnamese architects are leading the world in the design of houses and schools for the new reality of the information age. This presentation was originally delivered by me to an audience at the American Center in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam on 18 November 2020. It was the third part of a three-part series presenting modernism and contemporary architecture in Vietnam. Thank you to the American Center for hosting this series of presentations about architecture. As Monica said, the first one was about the characteristics of global modernist architecture. I think we get a little bit of echo from that, so I'll move over this way. Sound better over here? Yeah, sounds a lot better over here. Okay. Then the second session was about Vietnamese modernist architecture that showed how it fit the times of the mid-century, the mid-20th century, and also displayed Vietnamese identity as it moved into the industrial age. So today, we're going to look beyond modernism now, as the world has moved beyond the industrial age into the information age. Now, the fact of the information age now is pretty well set, pretty well agreed to by historians and academics in particular, because you see a lot of references now to it in books and magazines and academic papers. So that's pretty well set. But the architecture is wide open. So what I'm presenting today are my initial ideas. I'm starting research now on a book about information age architecture. So in 4 or 5 years from now, I might have completely different ideas about it. And hopefully I'll be back then to talk about information age architecture again. But first, we need to talk about how architecture fits its times through the ages of history. So historians, as they look back through the ages of history, and they're trying to determine what the people were like in those periods of history, architecture is a good marker for them to figure out, especially the values of those civilizations. So the ancient Greeks here, 2,500 years ago, you can see through the temple to Athena here, the patron goddess of Athens, Greece, in that ancient civilization, that religion was extremely important. So this building, as well as other similar temples that have been restored by archaeologists over time, definitely shows the values of that ancient culture, and it's been backed up by their writings and other historical artifacts. So throughout the ages of history, that's what architectural historians and historians do, is look at the primary buildings that come out of those civilizations. Now, it also reflects the aspirations of people, what the people themselves want them to be, or what they want their culture to be. Now, in the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, Gothic cathedrals were built all over Europe, and they were paid for by the people, usually people in the Roman Catholic Church, through offerings every week. And it took 100 years or so to build a cathedral. So all of those offerings added up so they could support the crew of workers working on the cathedrals. Now, this isn't quite a Gothic cathedral. It's a bit Gothic revival because it started construction in 1884. This is the Sagrada Familia Cathedral in Barcelona, Spain. Began construction in 1884. The architect was Antoni Gaudí, a Catalan, northern part of Spain, where Barcelona is. And towards the turn of the century, into the 20th century, Art Nouveau was an art movement that was beginning to lead us away from classicism towards modernism, and it was very organic, very fluid. And in a lot of respects, this design sort of looks ahead to the more fluid nature of the information age architecture that you'll be seeing here very soon. So the people of Barcelona have been paying for the construction of this cathedral because it represents their image of what they want Barcelona to be. It represents their aspirations. And architecture throughout the ages has done that. Now, the ideas and experiments of people, engineers and architects in particular, have also been very important in expressing their times at that time. Now, in the European Renaissance, 600 to 700 years ago, they looked to perfect the classical architecture that had been developed in ancient Greece and in the Roman Empire. And they did it by some experiments. Now, Filippo Brunelleschi developed, or he discovered, the principles of linear perspective. And people through the ages, 100 years, 100,000 years of human occupation on the earth, as people look, as you look, you were seeing things in perspective, but they didn't realize that, and they didn't understand how they could then take that and draw in perspective. But Filippo Brunelleschi, through some experiments, using some silver plates and getting some reverse images, he was able to figure out the scientific principles behind linear perspective. And he also noticed, as you look at the floor wall line there and then the ceiling wall line there, they converge out into infinity at a vanishing point. Well, here as you look down the cathedral, the vanishing point is right there at the altar, at the apse. So he used those principles to design this Basilica of San Lorenzo in Florence, Italy, 650 years ago. So frame by frame, or column by column, he followed through with the perspectives that he was drawing, the replication. So this set up very high standards for the classical architecture in the Renaissance. At the same time, this allowed him to check his proportions. Proportions are those ratios of units of space to the other units of space in the composition. So it's, you can see with the green lines, especially in the section there, those are squares. They're perfect squares. So the side aisles are 2 squares high. The central nave is 2 squares wide and 4 squares high, exactly. So that set up beautiful proportions in this particular basilica. And it represents ideas and experiments that composed all of Renaissance architecture, that perfected classical architecture. So it's ideas like that that fit those times. Now, what happens when we don't reflect the times today? What happens? Well, I took this photo a couple of years ago, pre-COVID. There were still tourists around, so I presume those 2 gentlemen are tourists, and I can just imagine what they're saying. Saying, wow, what a beautiful French colonial building that is. Must have been built in the 1880s sometime, right? It distorts history when we do things like this, because tourists certainly are confused. But not only that, for 40 years from now, believe me, because I went through this as I was cataloging Vietnamese modernist architecture, you don't quite know when it was designed, right? So you kind of take a guess based on what it looks like. So 40 years from now, I can guarantee you some architectural historians are going to think that's definitely classical architecture must have been built during the colonial period. So doing this kind of work distorts history. And not only that, but it's failed architecture. A shopping center, which this is, or was, I guess, Union Square, is an industrial age building type. So modernist buildings are usually shopping centers, and people can easily see that they're shopping centers, and they know how to get into them and know how to navigate in them. But the average tourist coming up to this building doesn't realize that it's a shopping center, so they never went in. Not only that, this particular version of classical architecture is very intimidating. It's hard to find the entrances. So they didn't go in even if they could figure out there might be something interesting in there. Those of us that lived here, of course, went there a time or two just to see what like, but we get ourselves lost in the bowels of the building where you couldn't figure out where you were and where you're going. So it completely failed. They had to shut it down as a shopping center. And that's what happens when architecture doesn't reflect the times today. Buildings like this, it's a recent building over the last 5 years, also result in loss of cultural identity. Now, this is at the corner of Lidacham Street and Ibachum Street. It's the fourth addition to the institution that's now called Chendai Nia Specialist High School. It originally was built in the 1880s as a colonial school, Tabard institution, the Tabard School. And their colonial building is still on the other corner on Nguyen Nhu Street. Now remember in the first presentation, if you were here, you can just barely see it on the right there of Hai Bachum Street. The first edition that was built in 1960 by Vietnamese architect Nguyen Kim Mang. A beautiful modernist composition, and that's why I used it in that presentation, because it displayed the ideas of modernism, taking a kit of parts and putting it together in a harmonious composition. And that building is a masterpiece that definitely illustrated the architecture of the industrial age of those times, the mid-20th century. Then, further to the left down Lidacham Street, here is another building built by the same architect at the same time. Completely different design, but also exquisitely modernist and also expressed Vietnamese identity. So the two additions built in the mid-century, expressing their times of the industrial age and expressing Vietnamese identity. But what does this building express? Buildings like this are also a lost opportunity to explore the experiments and ideas that lead to the new architecture that fits our times today. And it's not overtly classical, but it definitely reaches back a couple of hundred years for its inspiration of the design. So to me, it's a large building and a very prominent site. It's a lost opportunity to find the new architecture that expresses Vietnamese identity. Now, architecture schools stopped teaching classical architecture 80 to 100 years ago. There is a university in the world that does specialize in classical architecture, Notre Dame University in America, and its graduates, when they come out, they know how to design beautiful classical buildings if somebody wants one. But this is not a beautiful classical building. The original building, the Hotel de Ville, the People's Committee building, is a very beautiful colonial building. But this addition on the corner of Dom Coi and Lidacham Street, I'm sorry, it's just not adequate. It's not good architecture. And it doesn't reflect our times today. Now here's two buildings that did reflect their times at different periods of history, the top one being the French Governor General's Palace, occupied in 1873 during the colonial period. So it's definitely representing the colonial times. It was occupied in 1873. It was renamed the Nordam Palace in the 1920s. Then in 1954, at independence from colonialism, the new president of the state of Vietnam moved in with his family and renamed it the Independence Palace. But in 1962, a couple of his own pilots bombed the building in an assassination attempt, destroyed half the building, so they had to take the rest down and held a design competition to decide what would they build now. There were 7 invited entries. 5 of those entries were European neoclassical, one of which was to essentially rebuild it as it was. 2 of those were Indochine style, that fusion of French Beaux-Arts architecture with Asian ornamentation. The 6th entry was overtly Vietnamese traditional, but the 7th entry was this beautiful modernist masterpiece by Vietnamese architect Ngo Vic Tu. And how could they have done otherwise but to select this scheme? What would it have said to the world as a newly independent country, definitely with aspirations into the industrial age? It would have picked European architecture and said to the world, well, you know, we spent a long war of resistance and we won our independence, but in the end, we think that the European architecture is far superior to anything our Vietnamese architects can do. That's what it would have said to the world if they had not picked this. But the fact that they picked it is it's a masterpiece of modernist architecture. It's a masterpiece of Vietnamese identity. The perfect representative for the newly independent country. And therefore, it expressed its times. Okay, but in the early 1900s, the world was changing. We made the transition from the classicism of the agricultural age to the modernism of the industrial age. So in the early decades of the 1900s, the last of the beautiful classical buildings were being built. So in the upper right-hand image there is the U.S. Custom House in San Francisco. And it's a pure, honest, classical building. It's made of stone and masonry with the walls getting thicker towards the base. It uses the technology of the agricultural age, which classical buildings are supposed to use. They did use. And I put it here because I used to walk along there every day on my way to work and loved that building, thinking about those walls and how they were made. And then I had the opportunity in 2000 to be the architect for the renovation of the building because it needed a seismic upgrade to resist earthquakes. It made it through the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, but it broke the bonds between in the mortar between the stone and the brick, and that it would not have survived another earthquake. So we had to fix it up and still keep its historical value. Nothing got changed other than the addition of new concrete shear walls. But by the 1920s, there are lots of examples now of new modernist architecture. The left classicism far behind. This abstraction of light and geometry that became modernism, as represented in the rebuilt Schroeder House there in Utrecht, the Netherlands in 1924. And it's timeless. Even though it fits its time in the mid-century or in the early 20th century, you could plunk it down in Ho Chi Minh City today, and it would fit right in with all the Vietnamese modernist shop houses and villas. Vietnam, though, a decade later, was also going through its changes. So exciting times for architects because they were still building colonial buildings in the 1920s, as shown there in the National Treasury building along Winway Boulevard. The Fine Arts Museum buildings were being built in 1934 still. Art Deco apartment buildings were being built all over the city. But the first modernist building came along in 1931. That's now the Ernst Thälmann Secondary School at 8 Chenam Dow Street. And it's definitely a modernist building because it's a clear expression of structure, columns and beams. The wide, big, large openings, column to column, floor to floor, and then those bumps on the guardrail panels are not decoration, they're not ornamentation, they're an abstract modernist pattern of bumps. So the first modernist building. So those were exciting times as they were trying to figure out what the new architecture of the industrial age is going to be here. But times have been changing over the last 100 years, and we're now into the information age. So what characterizes our times today? This particular building here, I think, is an excellent example to start with. It's a performance center in Azerbaijan, designed by Zaha Hadid architects. When you look at it, that flowing form coming across the ceiling, down the walls, and then across the seating area is seamless. Just one flowing form that makes up the entire composition. So it's essentially all one material. So as we shall see now, as we head into the information age, how this represents the philosophy and science behind what became the information age. Now, those of you who were here for the first session, you saw this chart. The simple chart. Historians, for different reasons, have very detailed, segmented charts, but this is a simple chart that suffices for architecture and the arts. Throughout recorded history and the agriculture age, that entire red bar there represents all of recorded history. And so as people started to grow crops, tend animals, sit down in one place, started writing, which started to create the history, that was the agricultural age. Then in 600 to 700 years ago, during the European Renaissance, the scientific revolutions of those days, the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, upended what people in the agricultural age thought about, especially religion and the cosmos, the sun and the moon and the stars. Upended all of those ideas with new experiments in science. And that started to set up the conditions of modernity that eventually led to the industrial age, which began 350 years ago in the UK. And we've been in the industrial age ever since. So you notice that those ages overlap. And the reason they overlap is because each age has its own way of thinking, its own sense of reality. So some people make the gestalt shift or the paradigm shift of thinking into the new age, and a lot of people don't, for a lot of good reasons. If you're out there farming in a wheat field in America, it's okay. If you're still thinking in the agricultural age, no problem. But if you're in the sciences, you need to move on, and they have. So about 1900, new revolutions in science upended again what we thought we knew about reality in the industrial age. And that set forth the movement towards the information age, which through the last part of the 20th century really started to become stronger in the overall history. What happened in the early 1900s is Albert Einstein, with his theories of relativity, determined that time is relative. So you can imagine that. We still generally think of time as being absolute. I say if the clock says it's 2:36, you all will agree. But Einstein showed that that is fine for normal conditions, but it doesn't work at subatomic conditions or out in space, because a person on a spaceship approaching the speed of light, time slows down for him. So relative to a person on a planet over here, the person on the planet's getting older and older, but the person in the spaceship is staying young. Time became relative. That kind of stirs things up, right? The way we think kind of stirs up the way that we think. In addition, he found that gravity curves. We always think of gravity as being, one direction to the middle of the Earth. But gravity out in space, the gravity forces between the suns and the planets and the galaxies, they curve, and therefore the light waves from stars bend with that curvature of gravity. So it upends what we thought were absolute laws of mechanics. Now, Isaac Newton, 350 years ago, developed the laws of mechanics, of statics, classical mechanics. Best illustrated by, you go to a billiards hall, you got a pool cue, you hit that ball just exactly right, it goes in a very specific direction and hits another ball, you get this equal and opposite reaction. So the forces that you put on the pool cue, the exact point where you hit the ball, all these things can be calculated and set up in a scientific experiment, and they will result in the same result every time. So it could be predicted. So science was determinist. You could always determine what was going to happen with the laws of classical mechanics. But Einstein and then Max Planck, writing papers about quantum physics during the early 1900s, showed that, again, for most conditions that we live in, no problem. But subatomic and out in space, it doesn't work anymore. It all falls apart. Everything now is uncertain. You have to express things in terms of probabilities. It's no longer absolute. And that led us to the information age, where we now know. Unlike modernism, where you break things down into parts to study them, closed systems, we have to look at things in open systems all at the same time. Everything is interconnected. Therefore, we have to take a holistic view. Now, DNA. The structure of DNA, the double helix, was discovered around in the early 1950s by Crick and Watson. And as you can see there, it's a single molecule made up of 5 specific atoms. Now, the DNA, that molecule is in every cell of your body. And it's in every cell of every living thing, plants and animals. So everything that is in that molecule has all the information needed to make a new you or a new plant. All of the information. So every cell in your body has everything it needs to make a new you. Because those atoms along the long double helix of the molecule are pure information. So depending on the sequence of how the atoms are set up, it creates a piece of information that decides what color your eyes are, or whatever. So this is pure information, and that idea of having pure information like this everywhere in a composition became very important to information age science as well as philosophy and then the arts. So whereas in the industrial age, raw materials, parts, atoms, created energy and developed the machines to drive industry, in the information age, it's information of all kinds, data. And we usually look at information in terms of networks, the internet, for example, a network. But unlike industrial products, you can't look at them part by part. You can only look at a network as a whole. So therefore, you need to take a holistic view. So that is our new technology. So in terms of methodology, back in the agricultural age, if you're out there in a wheat field in Montana, you need to have some sense of knowing when to plant and when to harvest. Actually, this analogy is probably better in a rice paddy in Vietnam. So you're out there, and the way you could do that was by counting the phases of the moon. You didn't need a calendar, you didn't need a watch. It wouldn't have helped you much anyway. But if you knew what month of the moon, of the periods of the moon were, you knew when it was time to plant. And you knew several months later when it was time to harvest. So people lived by the periods of the moon, which eventually was codified in a lunar calendar. But they didn't really need it because they just kept track of where we were during the year, starting from the new year of Tet. But in the industrial age, things became very linear quickly. So if you can imagine you're going to make an industrial product, you're going to go out and dig up some iron ore someplace, and you're going to dig up some coal for energy, and you're going to have it all shipped, probably by railroad, to a smelter where it's all going to get melted down to make iron ingots. Those iron ingots are going to get shipped, probably by railroad, to a factory where it's all melted down again and to make steel. And then the steel bars get sent off to an industrial factory that makes cars, for instance. And all parts arrive from all over the place to get to make a car. The assembly line is linear. And the workers there have got to make sure they get to work on time. So they have to think of time themselves as being linear. And then as they're each part put together in a car, that's the industrial age. Time had to become linear rather than circular, or we would not have made it. So our sense of reality changed between the agricultural age and the industrial age. In the information age now, I really got ahead of myself here. I got to back up a second. The agricultural age is about common sense, knowing when to plant and when to harvest. But the industrial age is about experimentation, using what science told us about how things work in order to make steel, new materials, and products. But in the information age, it's theoretical knowledge as a basis for action. We just sent a spacecraft out to an asteroid to dig up some dirt and bring it back. The only way we know that was going to work was through historical knowledge, because it had never been done before. And everything now through the information age has been that way. Atomic power began with theoretical knowledge, and it led to power, but unfortunately it also led to weapons. And when they tested the first weapon, they weren't really quite sure what was actually going to happen. It happened the way they wanted it to happen, at least, but theoretical knowledge became the basis for action. So what I had been talking about was time, so I got a little bit ahead of myself there. So we've talked about time in the agricultural age being circular, the industrial age being linear, but in the information age, it's relative. And a better way to look at it is layered, because now people got friends all over the earth. So if you call them, or if you arrange a Zoom meeting with them, you better make sure you're not waking them up in the middle of the night. So you got to understand what their time is where they live relative to your time where you live. So you look now, we all tend to have a sense now that time is layered. It's not so important anymore that it be linear. So we take a more holistic view. If you're taking an online course through EDX, for example, Harvard University, the deadlines for examinations and for homework submittals are expressed in internet time, UTC, Universal Time, because students all over the world, they got to make sure they get their homework in at the same time. So they can't express it in terms of Eastern time in the United States, where Harvard's located. They have to express it in internet time. So internet time is now layered. So our sense of reality, if it hasn't changed, it is changing. So how does that affect architecture? Of course, in the agricultural age, you've got to get the forces of gravity down through natural paths, which means usually arches. Trabeation means closely spaced columns and very heavy lintels. And that was classical architecture, classicism. Whereas in the industrial age, we learned we could use the strength of materials to bend the forces of gravity in all different ways. So architecture became an issue of taking parts and putting them together in a harmonious composition. And that became modernism, modernist architecture. But now in the information age, we're now beginning to see that things are more interconnected, structures can be interconnected, and architecture can, to a large degree, can be data-driven. So in addition to our thoughts and imagination, we combine that with data and information to make new forms. And since the network is the analogy now, the metaphor for the information age, networks don't have shapes. You can't figure out, once you try to figure out a shape for the internet, within a fraction of a second, it's grown by many, many more web pages added. So you can't keep up with it. So it doesn't have a shape that we can understand. So now we're looking at new shapes, new forms in architecture, which are amorphous, that reflect the times of today. Now, between those periods of those ages of history, there were hinge points in architecture that led the way to the next age of history. So between the agricultural age and the industrial age, in other words, between classicism and modernism, this building in particular became a hinge point, because it made people think differently than they had been thinking. Before this, you couldn't conceive of doing domes like this. Now, when you look at the small domes around the base of the big dome, they're hemispherical. So they're nothing more than arches going around in a circle, the natural path of gravity down through those materials to the ground. But 700 years ago, architect Deconstruction thought this was a very interesting form, and it is, beautiful form. Then he put a heavy cupola on the top. But he had no idea how to build it. No way. People knew that once you started stacking up brick like that, it was just going to fall in right away because it wasn't following the natural path of an arch. But nevertheless, for 100 years, they were building the cathedral when they got to the time to build the dome. Still, nobody knew how to build it. But Filippo Brunelleschi, remember him from Perspective? Well, he sat down and found an inelegant solution, but it worked to build the dome, essentially using wood blocks and stone blocks and iron chunks to make a chain around the dome. And for the first time, he bent the forces of gravity. He restrained that heavy cupola from coming down and popping out the dome. And that, as an idea that you could bend gravity, just started to let architects and engineers say, whoa, this is something new. This starts to bring up all kinds of ideas. If we can only find the materials, which in the end were steel and reinforced concrete, then we can really build some interesting things that bend the forces of gravity. This building, therefore, is the hinge point between modernist architecture and the architecture of the information age, or between the industrial age and the information age. The Sydney Opera House in Australia, 1957. They held a design competition, and Jorn Utzon, a Danish architect, won the competition. These billowing sails, beautiful billowing sails, but he didn't know how to build it. It took a long time for he and engineers to figure out how to build it. It wasn't completed until 1973, that's 16 years. It took them that long to figure out how to build it, because at the beginning they didn't have the tools to do it with. But the tool that they needed was a computer. Now, Ovi Arup of Arup Engineers in London, one of the most, the best engineers, I think, around. He sat down with Jorn Utzon and they decided, look, we got to find a rational geometry at least for these cells. So they determined that if they use segments of a perfect sphere, and that's pretty rational, that's something they could start with. But then how you build it is another question. So Arup invested in a computer system where they could calculate the forces within each of the shells and then determine how to segment it into parts, build them in a factory, bring them out, hoist them up, and make sure they stay in place. They only could do it with a computer. So it's one of the first uses of computers in architecture and engineering, and therefore it's a hinge point towards a new architecture, towards new ideas. So looking back, remember, modernism is taking a kit of parts, making a harmonious composition. They're static. They don't move. They don't want to change. But it definitely expressed the industrial age. It expressed its times. But architects and learning from other disciplines, science and philosophy, started to look beyond modernism. Now, deconstructivism. A lot of people associate deconstructivism with the information age, but that doesn't really work, because if modernism is a kit of parts, deconstructivism simply takes those parts and tries to take them out or deconstruct them, whatever that means. So it's still, deconstructivism is still modernism, because it still uses parts in a composition. So you warp the surfaces like this, you provide a lot of angles, you're exploring deconstructivism, but it's still an outgrowth of modernism. It's like the equivalent of Art Nouveau to classical architecture. It's a way pointing outwards, but it's still in to modernism. The architect was Nguyen Chom Duc. I took the photo in 2007, so I think he built this in District 7, the Phu My Hung neighborhood, probably around 2006. I had a Vietnamese architect friend of mine call him to ask him what he was intending here, and he said, no, deconstructivism, that was his idea. But that was a good idea. I like this house. It's a beautiful design, I think. But and it was an experiment. This is how you find the new architecture. You experiment. He had an idea. He tried it out. Now, if the network is the metaphor for the information age, how we store and access information. Then buildings can sort of look like networks in a way and be constantly changing. Now, this is a theoretical idea, not a practical idea. But again, it's an experiment that leads towards a new architecture in the information age. So the idea here is you use carbon capture. So every day you're capturing carbon along a wire frame. So the building's constantly growing. And it's not a bad idea in these days of global warming to be capturing carbon out of the air. But like I said, it's a theoretical idea, not a very practical idea yet. But that idea of a changing building, constantly changing and having an amorphous shape, is definitely an information age idea. This building, the Galaxy Soho mixed-use building in Beijing, China, by Zaha Hadid architects, again, illustrates again using the computer to make these very fluid forms, very dynamic forms. You have to look at it as a whole, a holistic viewpoint. Her partner, Schumacher, uses the term parametricism to describe this kind of architecture, because they use a computer, they put in all of these inputs, these factors that impinge upon a design, and with their heads and with the computer they come up with a design like this. So parametricism might be a name for the architecture of the information age, but it's been around now for a few years and it hasn't quite stuck with architectural historians, so we're going to have to find a better name, I think. But the idea is definitely there. And you'll notice, again, it's essentially one material is expressed. Now, if in a network, data is distributed throughout, then you can find that data and find a new form. Now, this is the Bird's Nest Olympic Stadium in Beijing for the 2008 Olympics, designed by Herzog and Muron, Swiss architects, and Arup engineers again out of London. Now, it's an oval, but it's an irregular oval. It is lower on one side, higher on the other, had some irregular curves. But they could have said, well, let's just have a standard frame of steel, and we won't optimize it, so it'll be heavier than it needs to be in some places. But rather than doing that, they said, hey, let's just calculate the forces given this network, this form. Let's calculate the forces of structure and see what comes out of it. And what came out of it, they put the steel only where it was needed, exactly where it was needed, of the size that was needed. So therefore, this form was data-driven. And so information in this form is distributed throughout. And it expresses, therefore, randomness, for sure, morphousness again. And you'll notice that essentially one material is expressed. Now, just like DNA has all the information in one molecule that you need to make a new you, here, some students at the Laboratory for Computational Design in Beijing, which tells you right away they're going to deal with manipulation of information, of data. But they composed a single part, an irregular shape. It could be bent, folded, connected in different ways, but a single part, replicated 1,000 or 10,000 times, and then through the computer figured out how to put it together to build this beautiful sculpture. So all the information that was needed to make the sculpture is in one part. You just have to think, wow, now if I bend it this way, this way, this way, connect it this way, I get this beautiful sculpture. So again, essentially one material is expressed. Now this is another theoretical experiment, not too practical, but the idea here is biomimicry. They looked at the structure of bone growth in a body. And evidently bones look fibrous like that, lots of porous space. And they took data about how bones grow and put it into an algorithm that showed them how to build this house. So biomimicry, using biological processes to to help form up a house. Again, not too practical, but a very interesting theoretical idea that some days is going to result in some very interesting information age architecture. And once again, notice that a single material predominates. So if networks are again, the metaphor for the information age, shouldn't be too surprising that buildings now are looking like amorphous networks. Now, the lower right-hand corner, the Seed Cathedral by English architect Thomas Heatherwick for the UK Pavilion at Expo 2010 in Shanghai. It's pure information again. It's made up of fiber tubes with a seed at the end, at the outside, a seed. So just like that, again, that DNA analogy, all the information needed to make a plant is there at the end of each tube. Whether it becomes a tree or whether it's an orchid, it's that seed has everything needed to make that particular plant. So at the end of all of these rods, tubes coming out, are seeds that make up what you see. Pure data driven again, and amorphous, expressing the architecture of our times today. And again, a single material predominates. Now, amorphous shapes are kind of hard to understand, so some architects are using layering to make it easier. And layering's like, if you use Wikipedia. You go to Wikipedia, maybe you start with a more broad category, but once you get into an article, you can see how you can drill down, layer by layer, to find what you're really looking, or understand what you're really looking for. So similarly in layered architecture, that you can look beyond the layers and start to see the functions inside. And again, essentially one material predominates. Networks overlap in all kinds of ways that creates dissonance and randomness. So in the upper right-hand corner, the Biological Museum in Panama by Frank Gehry, highly dissonant with those colors and with the shapes of those roof forms as they cascade down. Highly dissonant. I love it. I like 21st century classical music, and that's a misnomer. So obviously it's not classical, it's atonal. You have to listen to it. It's highly dissonant, and that's the reason I like to listen to it. It really makes you think, as does this architecture. You know it's dissonant. The bottom right-hand corner, the Seattle Central Public Library by OMA Architects and LMN Architects, the local firm. They just stacked up the program requirements, square footage, square meters by square meter, and just wrap the form around it. So it's just randomness. Just another way of taking the network and expressing it. So, how are the Vietnamese doing? You'll notice in all of the examples I've been showing that they're all big buildings, performance halls, libraries, museums, all big buildings, so by star architects. They're not working on small buildings like houses and schools yet. But if you look at the parade of buildings every day on Arc Daily, for example, or on Architizer, people are noticing that, most of the buildings you see are houses, because that's mostly what gets built in the overall numbers of buildings that get built all the time. So they're mostly houses. You look at them from around the world, and these days they're exquisitely modernist still. Exquisite design, though, incredible design, but they're modernist. But people are starting to notice that the Vietnamese houses are different, because you can see it in the comments that they leave on Arc Daily in particular. Say, something's going on here. We don't know quite what it is, but something's going on there in Vietnam. Their architecture is different. Well, I think they're leading the way into the information age architecture for small buildings like houses and studios and schools. So here, there's a couple of projects here by Tropical Space Architects from Ho Chi Minh City. The top image there is their termitary house in Da Nang. Now, evidently, I've never spent much time in Da Nang myself, but I understand the temperatures are a little bit more extreme than they are here, hotter in the summer, colder and damper in the winter, or something like that. So Tropical Space looked at biomimicry again. They looked at how termites build their nets so that they can survive in a hostile environment. And when they looked at how the termites build their nest and they designed this house, it has double walls. They put kitchens and bathrooms in between the walls, but it has double walls, which help to moderate the outer climate with the inner climate. Biomimicry, a holistic view of a design for a house. In the bottom image, their terracotta studio is a layering effect. So they used layers to enclose the artisan process of making terracotta and how the steps that it goes through as it comes out of the building for drying. And you'll notice again that essentially one material dominates. Gin Chupo architect Tam Vu and his partner Lei Ani do a lot of research, holistic research on how children learn and how they behave in learning environments. They use that research in the design of facilities like the Chom Chom Tu Kim Kindergarten here in District 2 of Ho Chi Minh City. A very holistic approach to design that you see here, because children want a journey of discovery. So that's what this building is. It's a journey of discovery through. So that holistic view is a very information age idea. Back to Tropical Space, the Wasp House out in the Bintan district. They looked at wasp nests, and evidently wasp nests are fairly open as opposed to the honeycombs of bees, but because this house is very open and they're just living platforms that are somewhat transparent within the overall form. Biomimicry again. And then again, notice that essentially one material predominates. Back to Gin Chupo Architects again. This is their preschool up in Bao Nguyen, way up in the northern part of Vietnam. But, you know, in classicism, function followed form. You had a precedent form of a classical building, you plunked it down, then you stuffed the functions into it. In modernism, it was the opposite. Form followed function. You determine your functions of the building first, and then you put a form around it. But in the information age, when you take a holistic view towards design, form and function have to work together all at the same time. So to me, that's what this school represents. It takes the form and works with the functions within to make sure they're covered. It allows some insets to get light in through windows or wherever the entryway in. And it also reflects the geography, the rolling hills. So to me, it's a very holistic form. But better than that, this was a very holistic process, unlike anything else I've really ever heard of, because Dam Vu's services as an architect were pro bono, which means free. He's a volunteer. So he worked with the local people to talk about what they needed, what kind of architecture would fit what they needed, and they participated as he drew on the table new forms. And then the people themselves helped to build it. They got some expertise for free from some big Vietnamese contractors. Again, pro bono, volunteer time, a lot of volunteer materials, free materials. This whole process of design itself was very holistic, very interesting. Now you'll notice that the Vietnamese architects aren't doing any big whiz-bang curvilinear forms. So they're not really using the computer yet for form giving, like the star architects are around the world, and that's okay, because what they're really doing is they're laying a basis for eventually doing that. They got a holistic design process. Now this Chao Dap house down in the southwest part of Vietnam by Nishizawa Architects, he's not Vietnamese, of course, but he's lived here for so long. He knows how to design in Vietnam. And his approach is highly holistic and environmental, especially environmental. The client for this house wanted a 4 to 5 story masonry Saigon shop house. And he said, well, okay, we'll take a look at that for you, but let's take a look at the history of this land down in Chao Dup in the Mekong Delta. When you look at the history of flooding there every year, and that pattern's been changing with all the new dams up in Laos and China, but they're still flooding. If you can work around that to build a house that can raise and lower with the flooding, then you can still live there and have a decent life. So just by looking at the history, looking at a better way of putting things together, and this house is essentially a frame, just a network of frames. So therefore, one material predominates. It's a holistic view, a sense of design. And he didn't need a computer to do the overall form, but all of these Vietnamese architects are using computers for different things during the process. They're just not using it yet for form giving. So these are exciting times, once again, in Vietnam here, as the world has been changing. They're coming up with a new architecture of the information age, exactly 100 years later than the early 1900s, as they made that transition from classical architecture to modernist architecture. And here we are again with new architecture. At the same time, we're still building a lot of modernist buildings around. Unfortunately, we're also building faux colonial buildings for God knows what reason. But now we're starting to see a new architecture here of the information age. So that'll be the subject of my next book. I hope to be back here in 3 or 4 years, 5 years, to talk about how I think it really turned out. So thank you very much. I'd love to hear some questions from you. Go ahead, Michael.
Can you back up one slide?
Sure.
This house floats?
No. See those concrete columns? The house, the frame literally can be lifted up and down on the concrete columns.
Oh.
So they lift it
By
manually.
hydraulics?
Or probably a winch or just a crank. Just a crank.
Okay.
Nothing fancy.
Okay, and my second question was, why do you think it took so long for people to figure out linear perspective? Like thousands of years.
Well, they probably didn't feel they needed to, right? People do things when they finally need to do something, I think, right?
Okay.
And Brunelleschi realized that he needed to figure it out. He had a cathedral to design.
Okay.
So that's one period. See, that's the times, right? It reflects the times. People find a need now because of the times. The times have changed. Now they realize, hey, I need this. So therefore, the architecture reflected the times that resulted from that.
Okay, thank you.
Internet question? Okay, question from off Facebook. So welcome to all you people out there on Facebook watching this. Okay, what are the impacts of the information age on modernist architecture? Well, it's like classical architecture in the early 20th century. Eventually, we stopped doing them, or I hope we stopped doing them. Because we don't want faux modernist buildings, like we got faux colonial buildings that aren't well designed because we no longer know how to do them correctly. So I hope modernist architecture, we keep the modernist architecture that we have. We keep that record. We don't tear it down. It's beautiful architecture. It represented the times of the mid-century perfectly and represented Vietnamese culture, represented Vietnamese identity. Don't tear them down. They're heritage. Heritage buildings now. And we shouldn't be tearing down colonial buildings either, because they're heritage. They're our history. But as Vietnamese information age buildings come along, I hope that it represents Vietnamese identity and therefore represents its times. So eventually, a lot fewer modernist buildings will be designed. So a question here from the audience before I go to the next one. Okay, let's try this one. Will 3D printing enhance architectural design? I thought there was one I had here. That was 3D printing. 3D printing is simply taking data from the computer and letting it flow into a machine that can make new architecture. So yes, it's going to definitely have an impact on architectural design. Unfortunately, a lot of the examples we're seeing so far are pretty prosaic buildings. They're not really very interesting buildings, but they're perfecting the technology, and eventually somebody's going to use it for a very interesting piece of architecture that definitely represents our times today. So it'll get there. How do environmental concerns shape modern architecture? I think, as you can see here in the Chowdup house, that house design was all environmental. It was all about environmental data, especially the history of the environment in that area, and therefore heavily impacted the design of that house. So you could say that it's modernist architecture, which actually it is, if you really get down to it, but it's the process that he went through, which is really information age, a holistic view. So we're in that transition period between modernism and the new architecture of the information age, and this represents right about the middle of that transition and how important it is to use environmental concerns in design. So this is really the same question: what are the impacts of the information age on modernist architecture? Like I say, it'll be a while before we stop seeing new modernist architecture. It'll keep happening. Took a long time in the 20th century for modernist architecture to entirely replace classical architecture. And what we're seeing now in the 21st century, I think, with these faux colonial buildings is a reaction against the new architecture now of the information age. It's a reaction. But instead of going back to modernism, they jumped way over back 200 or 300 years. Eventually, they'll give up. I hope. They'll definitely regressive. Yeah, no question. Any other questions? You need so we can hear you. It's not just me that needs to hear you, it's those people out on Facebook. And in the last session, we had 4,500 people watching during this. So there's a lot of people out there. So go ahead.
So first of all, thank you for doing this. I'm learning a lot. I find the biomimicry quite interesting. But modern human are sometimes not suitable to be in the wild, in the nature. So I'm wondering that if biomimicry have some flaw, because I don't know how to express myself. but I think that do you think that the process of using the computer to mimic the nature could create some like incompatibility to the way modern humans live?
Okay, I sort of understand that. One way of answering that would be, okay, they take a biological process and they mimic that in architecture. If the materials of the architecture are inanimate, they're not live, they're not a plant, they're not an animal, it's just materials, then it's difficult to see that that would be a problem. It might not look good, and they might decide this isn't worth doing. But it's probably not a problem for necessarily for the environment. The building shape or form or size may have impacts on the environment we don't like, but we ought to be paying more attention to that anyway. Where it might be a real problem is if we took a biological process and started to use real live materials to build buildings, then we're starting to talking about something that could definitely go wrong. That idea might also go right. So there's going to be some experiments someday in that.
Thank you.
And then there's a question back there. Do you have a microphone here? Hand that to me. Okay, good.
Hello, sir. During the talk, you mentioned some names, architects and firms that design these houses. May I ask who are some other examples of architecture firms and people who are pioneering in exploring the Vietnamese identity in this modern architectural age? And do you see this as a trend that is catching on in the near future?
Well, first of all, I definitely think it's a trend that's going to catch on now and into the future, definitely. As far as other architects, there are several that I could mention, but I can't quite remember their names because a lot of them are anagrams. They're like ABC architects or VND architects, things like that. I just can't. I've just started this research, and I've been paying so much attention to Vietnamese modernist architecture for the last several years that I have not been keeping up. So I'm just now finding, and I've got a little database I'm accumulating now of Vietnamese architects, and I've got about 15 of them now that I think are doing good information age architecture, but I'm an old man, just not remembering them right offhand.
Thank you.
Questions from the internet again. How about sustainable solutions for areas suffering from severe flooding? Well, again, this example here from Nishizawa Architects down in the Mekong Delta, obviously, is a solution that deals with flooding. That was the primary historical factor through time in the Mekong Delta that has to be dealt with. So this is an example of how architecture sustainable solutions have come about. That maybe the questioner, though, is thinking about the kinds of flooding we have here in Ho Chi Minh City when there's high tides at the same time that there's heavy rains. Seems to me those kind of solutions, sustainable solutions, have got to come on a citywide basis. If you design a house along a street that gets a lot of flooding, all the time, then you ought to have it raised up enough so that your house doesn't flood and your possessions aren't damaged. So there are things you can do. The point is you got to take a holistic view of it. You got to look at the history, and you got to find the data that tells you what happens over history in terms of flooding, for example, to come up with an architecture, your architecture for your house or for your office building that is sustainable and resists the impacts of flooding no matter where you are. Like this house did in the Mekong Delta. I love this house. So for students with architecture majors, what should we learn or prepare to adapt to the information age? Good question. Great question. Oh, boy. Well, certainly, most architecture students I know and work with, they're up to date on the new architecture. They're following Art Daily every day, seeing what's being built around the world, as well as what's being built once here. So they're seeing the examples, and they're coming to their own conclusions about what they're seeing, which is good. When I walk through the studios at the University of Architecture over on Pasteur Street, I'm seeing some very interesting design work that fits into the new age, the new information age architecture. So I'm seeing some very interesting work that's going on there. So somehow students are accumulating information. But I've talked to some of the Vietnamese architects I know. When they went to school at the University of Architecture, there were a lot of holes in their education. They knew they had to go out and plug those holes on their own, and they do. And that's what students today do. Every school of architecture has this problem. There are holes in it that you know need to be filled. So you go out there and figure out a way to fill them on your own. And that's what architects do, and that's what students do. So what you should do is be prepared, I think, to have initiative, to go find out what you know you don't, what you think you don't know. Go out there and find it. I have watched some clips about the drawbacks related to voice recognizing or built-in technology in living places. Can you please suggest solutions? Should we combine both smart and traditional gadgets? Voice recognizing? I don't know. My house is pretty new, 6 years old, but I don't have any of these things. So I don't have any experience with this kind of technology. So I had a low budget, so I had to use standard off-the-shelf electrical switches and plugs and plumbing items. So I don't have any of this new technology in my house. The house is information age, that's my house. But it's modernist in the inside. Definitely modernist. So I'm sorry, I don't have the experience or the knowledge of what really you're asking here.
Hiya. Do you think national or cultural identity and architecture is going to be lost somewhat in the information age? Because if you look at the building behind you, for example, on that wall, it's we've been copying it since the Romans or whenever, and they from the Greeks, and it's the idea of lasting throughout history. But with individual architecture companies constantly innovating new ways and presumably each country wanting to randomly innovate to say random things about themselves, maybe like Sydney presumably did in the 1950s, with creating that new building to represent themselves as a in a new way. Can you see it heading in that direction? And what do you think that means culturally, if everything is random and disparate in how we, in the buildings that we surround ourselves with, is it possible to still have a collective identity in some way?
Okay, I think I understand your question. I'll start by saying that before we get to information age architecture, we already lost a lot of identity with modernism. So as modernism through the mid-century did a pretty good job of capturing different people's identities around the world. You know, the mid-century modernist architecture in Southern California and other parts of America was beautiful and definitely represented the peoples of those cultures. And the same kind of architecture here at the same time, to me, definitely represented Vietnamese culture, Vietnamese identity. But the architecture over the last few decades now has become more globalized, in my opinion. International style high-rise buildings are a major part of that. They look the same everywhere. But the design of houses, again, as you look at them on Art Daily, coming from all around the world, they're all starting to, they're very exquisite, they're beautiful, but they're all starting to look the same. And that's part of what happens at the end times of an architectural style. As it starts to fall apart, it becomes more decadent and no longer does what it should be doing. And that's why we're going in now into a new age. So is the information age going to do a better job of determining identity? Well, one thing that it has going for it is that unlike modernism, which was standardized parts, standardized approaches, very determinate views of things, breaking things down into parts, looking at closed systems. Now in the information age, when we look at things holistically, we have the ability to customize. Everything now can be customized. It doesn't have to be standardized. So if it can be customized, it can be customized to achieve cultural identity, if we want to do that. So the promise is there, I think, in information age architecture to fairly easily represent our times today and express local cultural identity. The buildings that we saw from Tropical Space and Kim Chu Po architects, I think, are expressing Vietnamese identity, even though they've moved on now from modernism. And the fact that their buildings are essentially one material, it's interesting, they still manage to do that. So I think the promise is there for it to happen, but whether or not all around the world architects are going to step up to the plate and do it remains to be seen. I think it's too early to say. Does that help answer your question, I hope? All right, thank you. All right. Well, do I think that the lack of historic preservation is a reaction to the negative aspects of colonialism? My first answer is no, but let's take a look at that. Colonial architecture here represents the period of history here that we cannot deny that colonialism happened here. So the architecture that resulted from colonialism here represents the history of this country. Whether it's good history or bad history, it's here, it exists. And a lot of it happens to be very beautiful. And then a lot of it does represent historical events that are very valuable to retain. So social values, historical values, aesthetic values. We've identified what's important, which buildings have these values. So yes, we should retain these buildings through historic preservation or historical conservation of buildings and not destroy their historical value to us, even though they may have resulted from the negative aspects of colonialism. And most architectural historians in Southeast Asia pretty much agree with that colonialism was a bad thing. And we've stepped out of colonialism now and finding a new architecture, but you don't destroy the history, the historical values. I agree reserving traditional architecture is important. However, it is quite inconvenient living in an ancient house. How can we balance modernity and cultural reservation? I'm not quite sure what cultural reservation means. Maybe it means, yeah, maybe, but I think what it means is traditional architecture is cultural, very cultural, definitely demonstrated Vietnamese identity. So that is cultural reservation, keeping those memories of what that are engendered by people in the traditional architecture. So as I made the argument in the last session about Vietnamese modernist architecture, that it leaned very heavily on the memories that the architects had from their study of Vietnamese traditional architecture, so they could get the sense of Vietnamese identity and bring it into modernism without copying the traditional architecture. But Vietnamese people saw the new modernist architecture, especially for shop houses, and they could see their memories of the traditional architecture. And they started building their own houses using these new modernist techniques and designs that kept the memories of the traditional architecture. So Which houses are ancient? There's a couple ways you could look at that, and you talk with Vietnamese people about the modernist architecture out there now, that the houses that are 50 years old, they consider them to be ancient and old, and they're time to go away, right? They haven't quite figured out what they're replacing them with, but nevertheless, they don't have an appreciation, therefore, of heritage and historical conservation. So somehow, through activism, we need to increase people's awareness of the social and economic and historical and aesthetic values of our mid-century architecture, modernist architecture. If you mean an ancient house is a bamboo framed thatch roof hut, well, then you probably got a point that it's quite inconvenient. So maybe if you live down in the Mekong Delta, you live in one of these houses. But what happened, as I showed in the last presentation, that from 1975 on, most of them got torn down and replaced with new modernist masonry houses. So you only live in an ancient house like that because you decide you like it, I think. And because you got choices, and they're not that expensive to make. So you move on. So. Okay, last question. Hopefully there's one here. Last opportunity. Okay, Michael, you get the last one. Here she comes. Okay, there you go.
Referring back to your comment about modernism in the Southwest United States, do you see a parallel between what was going on here in Vietnam and what was going on in the United States
Oh, yeah,
at the
definitely.
same time?
Yeah, definitely.
So were there, each one was influencing the other to
No.
a certain aspect or not?
No, it's complicated because when you look at the mid-century modernist architecture, especially in the Southwest of America, they're very light frame because the climate there is a little bit more like the climate here, not as humid, much drier, but very warm, hot at times. So the houses are much more open than houses up in northern areas. And the houses here are similarly very open. So they became very similar. There was an architect here that I showed in my last presentation called To Công Ban, who was very expressive. And he used these butterfly roofs, these V-shaped roofs. When you look at the mid-century modernist architecture in California, same form. Did he see this in a picture someplace and started to use it here? We don't know. There's no way of knowing, But I think it's reasonable to assume that maybe he did. So what? It was a nice form and it fit the houses that he was designing here. So that's how architecture moves around the world, this communication. People see things, and they like it, and they experiment with it. They make it different. They don't just copy it. They make it different, make it fit their own conditions and their own culture. And that's how modernism occurred here. The difference in Vietnam from many other countries, though, is that they had no direct foreign influences. There were no foreign architects here to influence the architecture, whereas in Thailand and in Cambodia, Malaysia, there were lots of foreign, in Japan in particular, lots of foreign influences as they were developing their mid-century modernist architecture. So the Vietnamese pretty well did it on their own, and they certainly saw pictures in magazines and books. So they were influenced, but not directly. Okay, they want to bring this to a close. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I've seen lots of you here that were here in all three. I really appreciate your interest in architecture, and I hope to see you again here someday. Thank you.